the disciples over and over again. Who's going to be sitting next to you in heaven? Aren't you going to overthrow the government? Well, they don't specifically ask him that, but Peter right here is going, but you're not going to die? Are you kidding me? You can't die and be right. What are you talking about? That's not what you're here to do. Son of David, right? As he's going into Jerusalem, last time David went into Jerusalem, Jerusalem fell and David became the conqueror. So this image is very intentional, but is Jesus living up to the worldly standard or God's standard with this? What is up, everybody? So we are in week 7 of Matthew Bible study, self-paced style, section 2. Break them up like that so it's self-paced. You can go through, at your own pace. That's the kind of the point. But week 7 is going over chapters 14 through 17. And so we kind of got through most of 15 last week. So we're going to wrap up last video. So we're going to wrap up here. But this is about the Messiah being revealed. And so previously we saw Jesus walking on water, and when he was, identifying himself, he actually uses the same language that we see in the Exodus story with Moses when he says, what are people going to call you? And he says, I am. When Jesus says, it is I, it's actually the same way that God responded with his name. So Jesus is doing something very intentional, deliberate there. And then we see Peter's confession of the Messiah here. And so we're going to get into some of that, some interesting pieces of that, and then we're also going to go through the theological themes, and they kind of tie in, obviously to the bigger pictures here. But we're going to talk about weak faith and how we have weak faith, but God is powerful, right? His sovereignty and control over everything helps us even with our weak faith. We're going to talk about how Jesus is kind of mirroring Moses in some ways, in very intentional ways. And then we're going to talk about the church, because Jesus tells Peter that he's the rock that he's going to build his church on. So I wanted to make sure that we covered that. So with that, let's get into it. So right off the bat, the Pharisees and Sadducees are demanding signs, and Jesus says an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, which is interesting because that's evil and adulterous were terms that the prophets used quite a bit. Adultery, as in they weren't being faithful to God. And so because of this, Jesus even warns the disciples, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the disciples in this, sheer panic, they actually think Jesus is talking about bread. We didn't bring any bread. Who was supposed to bring the bread? So it's a very human moment for the disciples, and Jesus is like, you don't get it? Seriously? And I love the book of Matthew because there are many moments where it shows the humanity of the disciples, type of shepherding that Jesus has to do with them, the type of teaching Jesus has to do with them. So anyways, they get into Caesarea Philippi, and he asked the disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And he said, well, some people say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others, Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. So basically a who's who of the prophets. Like, yeah, this guy's a prophet. Which one is he? Is he like? And Jesus says, no, but who do you say I am? And Simon Peter replies, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon. You're the rock that I'm going to build my church on. It's not flesh and blood that would have given this to you. Only the Father would have been able to give this to you, this knowledge that I'm the Christ. And so he actually goes on and says that I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed. And he goes on to say that, don't tell anyone at this time that I'm the Christ. So he's like, it's fine, now you're in on the secret, but we're not going to tell anybody. So how does this show the important role of the church here? I mean, this is a pretty pivotal moment in Jesus' ministry. He says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That's a heavy charge. How do you think we're living up to that now? So I think context is really important for this, because before, Jesus is talking about the leaven of the Pharisees and the disciples, right? This idea that we have to keep the right doctrine, the right thoughts, the right inputs going in our head and our heart, right? We have to understand this the appropriate way. Then, after that, after he talks about building the church, he's going to talk about his death and resurrection again, right? Like he's actually going to talk about that next, and take up your cross and follow me. right? And so this is right smack dab in the middle of this idea of Jesus saying, protect yourselves against false doctrine, and take up your cross and follow me. And right in the middle of that, he's saying, I'm going to build my church and the gates of hell are not going to prevail against it. Do you think we're living up to that charge now? As you look around at churches, are we impacting the culture, or is the culture impacting the church? The other piece of this is oftentimes we think of churches as kind of a defensive, like a castle, and that the world is kind of attacking the church. Like a lot of times when we think about the church, we think of it as like a stronghold almost. But here it's actually reversing that. It's saying that the gates of hell will not stand against the church. This to me is a huge picture of being evangelistic in our calling, of going out and storming the gates of hell. And again, when I look at the church, there are clear delineations. There are churches that are sitting around waiting to die right now. They're aging populations, younger people aren't coming in, there's no new life. And on top of that, their message is completely irrelevant and wishy-washy and just really squishy compared to the world. The world is actually destroying many institutions. Now, the caveat here that I would like to point out is I don't think, this might get me in trouble, I don't think that's the church. I don't think, it says right here, the gates of hell aren't going to prevail against the church. So if your church isn't attacking the gates of hell, and if you don't see the gates of hell out there in society right now waiting to be attacked, then you're insane. Like, you open your eyes a little bit, right? I talk about this in the last video. There's also a fear of becoming angry and bitter and all. We need to leave that aside 100%. That's not what we're called to do. In fact, that's one thing after studying the Bible and looking at the Reformed history of the church, I have been incredibly convicted to give up any kind of anger and bitterness. And it is a struggle because these days outrage is a dopamine hit. Like everybody's tailoring their YouTube, mainstream media, all of these places are trying to get people angry, trying to get people emotional or excited, or to get them to scroll more, make more money. I think that we equally have to recognize the threats out there in the world and also protect ourselves against getting angry and bitter. But this idea really needs to be ground into our head that the church's role is to storm the gates of hell. That's part of it. And I feel like churches are in a very vulnerable, like churches, institutions, but the global church I see going strong, and I am very heartened by the fact that there are many Christian leaders standing up against these issues that are just horrendously affecting the world right now. So another interesting part of this is Peter identifies Jesus as Christ, but he still doesn't fully understand the nature of the Messiah. And so we see this kind of what I was just talking about. A lot of people in Jesus' time thought that he was going to bring a violent overthrow of the Roman government. There's evidence throughout all the Gospels that the people were really amping up. There were Jesus mobs around. The Romans were a little bit worried. The Jewish establishment was very worried, right? Because they're already in Roman control. But the Jews were very sick of being oppressed, and they're under the boot of the Romans right now. A lot of people thought, yes, son of David. That means battle. That means a warrior king. That means somebody fighting for us, leading us into battle, glorious victory. But is that what Jesus delivered? And so as Christians, we have to look at that. And we see a little bit here when he talks about the death and resurrection. Jesus is talking about his own death and resurrection. And Peter says, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." He's having none of it right off the bat. So we see Peter even getting caught up in this, you're going to die and be, what in the world? He can't wrap his head around it. It goes back to that. We need to not be angry, bitter. We need to attack the gates of hell, but we need to have compassion and love for those around us. That is so difficult to do these days. So far we've got a lot of evidence that Jesus isn't living up to people's expectations, right? This is one thing I'll point out with this, though, is that this is something that we really need to model ourselves after Jesus. Jesus doesn't care what the disciples think. He doesn't care what his friends think. He doesn't care what the church thinks. He's the only standard he's comparing himself to is God's. And so as he goes around being mean to the Pharisees, and everybody's like, aren't you being mean to the Pharisees? This is very important. And this is to stay away from anger and bitterness is our problem. We need to own that, and we need to do that. That's a very serious charge, I think. But the next part here is that while we're doing that, we need to be measuring ourselves by God's standard and not anybody else's. Again, there's evidence here that Jesus is not really living up to anybody's standards, worldly standards around him. John the Baptist sent messengers to ask Jesus, wait, dude, are you the one or not? The disciples over and over again, who's going to be sitting next to you in heaven? Aren't you going to overthrow the government? Well, they don't specifically ask him that, but Peter right here is going, but you're not going to die? Are you kidding me? You can't die and be what are you talking about? That's not what you're here to do. Son of David, right? As he's going into Jerusalem, last time David went into Jerusalem, Jerusalem fell and David became the conqueror. So this image is very intentional. But is Jesus living up to the worldly standard or God's standard with this? So when talking about his death and resurrection, he's actually goes on and he says, there are some standing with him who would not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So how does that fit with the transfiguration, Jesus' death and resurrection? Jesus is bringing this new age, this kingdom, while some of the disciples are still alive. So there's an age from the prophets up to now, and then Jesus is bringing about a new age. So the next thing that happens is the transfiguration, and so Jesus goes up onto a mountain. The transfiguration is similar to when Moses went up on the mountain, right, to receive the law. So what are some of the similarities there? God shining in his glory, the fact that Moses took people with him and Jesus brings a couple people along with him. There's a very specific reference to 6 days that happens here leading up to the ascension up the mountain before the transfiguration. And then you have the appearance of a devouring fire. So very intentional imagery that ties Jesus to Moses here. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about a prophet like Moses and how Jesus fulfills different narratives. And, you know, there are multiple prophecies and characters that Jesus is alluding to that had different types of authority, whether it's kingly authority in David or like a mediating prophet authority of Moses and these types of things. Jesus is taking all of those onto himself. So there's another interesting thing that happens. The disciples aren't able to cast out a demon, and they bring him to Jesus, and Jesus is able to cast him out. And he says this type can only be cast out by prayer. And this, I listened to a sermon by Martin Lloyd-Jones. It was a phenomenal sermon, but he was doing a series about revival. And he brings up this story. But the disciples bring this boy who they can't cast out the demon to Jesus, and he says this type can only be brought, sent out by prayer. And he says, how long am I going to tolerate this? Why can't you do this by now? Shouldn't you have learned by now the right things that you need to know? And you have little faith. If you even had a little bit of faith, you could move a mountain, right? So he's chastising the disciples here pretty harshly. And what does this teach us? There's 2 points I want to make. What does this teach us about the importance of trusting in God's ability instead of our own? Like when they couldn't handle it, what did they do? They brought it to Jesus, and Jesus handled it. And then not only that, but he gave them prescription. There's a good example here, again, with Moses, where Moses is a great example of this. God says, Moses, you're going to lead the people out of Egypt. And he says, not me, please not me. I don't speak real good. I can't do this. I'm not the guy for you. I'm probably, my past might hang me up. Lots of reasons, right? And God says, Moses, you're going. I'll bring Aaron along, but you're going. And so that's a great example of somebody knowing humbly that it is a big responsibility to worship God, to actually put yourself in the service of God and do that day in and day out. The other point with this that Martin Lloyd-Jones brought up is that when we look at revival and reformation around us, that we need to get the prescription right. And so Jesus, when the boy is brought to him, says this type can only be brought out by prayer. The disciples weren't doing it right because they misread or did not understand the situation. And so we as a church and as a people, Christians, trying to worship God, one of the things that we must do if we want reformation and revival in this country, in this world, in any community that you're a part of is you cannot be misled as to what the actual problem is. There's a very telling, there's a very interesting anecdote in the Screw Tape letters where one of the letters he's saying, the point is for everybody to be grabbing for fire extinguishers in a flood or running to one side of the boat instead of the other, right? This idea that the ultimate confusion for humanity is in our day and age to point out the wrong thing as being the sin. And so in a world filled with sexual immorality and identity crisis that's leading to massive records of anxiety, depression, and suicide, instead of recognizing that they need a harsh truth preached to them that they're rejecting, instead of looking at us not being compassionate enough by not providing truth, we think the sin is not being kind enough or not being nice enough. If we get the prescription wrong, then literally in these generations coming up, there's going to be record numbers of suicides. And I think that it's going, unfortunately, I pray about this regularly. I don't want this to happen. But if you look around, people are getting it wrong, and it's leading to death cults all around us. Like, people are literally dying because of ideologies that are destroying their minds and their hearts. We as Christians have the answer. And if we're not brave enough to say that, even if it ruffles feathers or we're seen as unkind for a little bit or whatever it is, the ultimate kindness here, if he would have let the Canaanite woman, what's actually compassionate in that situation is applying the fix. We can't just let these things go. That's not, if we see demons that need cast out, we need to apply the right fix. So there's that. Well, before I get into the next bit in the theological sections, put comments below on anything that's interesting you. Like and subscribe if you like these videos, please. That helps so much, and it just keeps me going. And start a conversation in the comments. Let me know something interesting that you thought about this section of the book. All right? So theological themes. Weak faith, powerful God. Just like Moses, we see Simon Peter here failing a few times, and he just keeps going. But there's no amount of faith that you can summon that will ever replace the power of God in your life. There's no way for you to exist without God. That's it. Another thing about all these instances of faith is a lot of times he says, you have little faith. And so we think, we need more faith, right? But that's what's interesting is he says, even if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, this is intentional, because I think that one of the things that's being pointed out here is it's not just faith, because everybody has a little bit of faith in something, even if they don't acknowledge it. But the point here is that have faith on the right thing, to put that faith in the right soil, to have the cornerstone of your life be Jesus, to have the foundation be solid. That produces faith. And then you can take your little tiny bit of faith and put it on that and watch it grow. We need to take whatever faith we can muster and put it in Jesus. It's not necessarily the amount of faith or the quality of the faith. It's what we put our faith in. So the next point that I'm going to talk about is this idea being Jesus being a prophet similar to Moses. And when Jesus is transfigured, it's one of the many times in which Jesus is compared to Moses in the Exodus story. And it brings up images of the law and a mediator and this idea of a saving figure, a Messiah figure, of which Jesus ultimately fulfills. Like, he's the ultimate fulfillment of this, whereas Moses was a shadow of this fulfillment. During the transfiguration, even God the Father repeats the words of the baptism, "This is my Son with whom I am well pleased." So this is a very interesting point for Trinitarians, because Jesus is fully human on earth, and the Father is speaking from the heavens to his Son, both fully God. It's this beautiful picture. And he says, "This is my Son with whom I am well pleased." God also adds this time, "Listen to him." So this identity, as I say it, Isaiah's promised servant, is affirmed, right? Isaiah talks about this coming servant, this promised servant, the Messiah, and this is being affirmed in this moment of the transfiguration. And as Moses was the instrument of bringing the law to the people, Jesus does it more perfectly, bringing the law and explaining the intent of the law. So as Moses brought the law, Jesus is literally being not the law being delivered, but the fulfillment of the law being delivered. And so what do we do with that? Theological point number 3, the church, right? I will build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, right? Gates of hell. Gates aren't offensive, they're defensive. We talked about this a little bit before, but the gates of hell are meant to be stormed. And if you watch my last video, I talk about how, if you want a garden to be full of weeds, all you have to do is let it go. I think this is what is happening in the world. The world is a garden bed, and all these metaphors and parables about seeds, I think, are incredibly intentional, because if you want a garden full of weeds, really all you have to do is let it go to seed. Just leave it alone. That's all you have to do. And it will sprout weeds. We are called to intentionally weed the garden, to get those weeds out of there, to make something beautiful, to grow fruit, and to attack the gates of hell. That's what the church is made for. The church is an assault weapon. It's not a defensive bastion. So what is the church? Church is several things. The church is buildings and communities. It's groups of believers. It's the Catholic Church, as in the total church of believers globally, with the saints that have died previously and the saints to come, your children. It's the body of Christ. It's living out Christ's will in the world. Anybody doing that is part of the body of Christ. One of the things that I think we need to take hope in is the fact that God promises the church doesn't fall, the church prevails. And so we need to remember that God's plan is sovereign. And it's fascinating to me to look throughout history and see that despite any persecution, the church continues to grow. And in fact, some of the countries like North Korea, they can't stamp it out, and it's growing like crazy because of the hope it provides, because people are hungry for real justice, not social justice or all this garbage CRT crap, but actually real justice. They're hungry for it. There is no justice without a perfect God. So we need to remember the church is going to win. We can let our anger and bitterness go about the worldly affairs easily, because we're promised that this is going to turn out okay. We win. I don't know exactly what that looks like. That's where you get into arguments about eschatology and like real weird theological stuff. It's not that weird, but it's heavy stuff. And I don't fully grasp all of it. But what I do know is that we win, that God wins. His sovereign plan is carrying us forward. God's not going to allow defeat in any arena, earthly or heavenly. So we have that promise that should bring us peace, should alleviate our anxiety. So, and with that, that's all I've got now. We're going to go into week 8 next, so I'm very excited about that. But I'll be praying for you. Please like and subscribe if you haven't by now. And again, I'm going to be praying for you. I hope you're enjoying digging deep into your Bibles. I hope that you've been trying to cultivate your prayer life and being active in your churches. All these things, these normal things, are actually what's going to change the world for the better. So I hope that you are joining me in doing that the best that we can. And with that, I'll catch you in the next video. All right, peace.